morning, gang. Can you hear me? All right. Today we welcome Alyse Rosner, who is our first Rockwell visiting artist for 2019. Who'da thunk? Ms. Rosner is a very winning human being and a really terrific painter. She has an MFA from the American University in Washington, and she took her BFA at the University of Michigan. She makes those large-scale acrylic paintings that you've seen in the gallery and that I hope you'll continue to look at through this month. I always tell my students that I think one of the most interesting thing happening in contemporary painting for me is the idea of layers of ideas reflected in layers of material, of media. I think that's the closest thing that we can talk about today in terms of the world that we're in right now. She's represented by the Rick Wester Gallery in New York. If you would, please welcome Alyse Rosner.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Chigadons, for the opportunity to speak here and to show my work. I'm so honored to be here. So I'm going to give you some background, some influences, and I'm going to show you my work. So this is a painting that I was working on last winter in my studio. It's acrylic on raw canvas stapled directly to the wall. Let's see. Slight technical things. Okay, now I'm adjusted. Okay, so this is my mom. She's an artist, and I grew up in a house where there were always jars of solvent and oil paint on the kitchen counter. We were surrounded by things she was making or had made, weavings, ceramic pieces, still life, and landscape paintings. This photograph is a self-portrait she made when I was in middle school. This pot was made by Toshiko Takiezo. My mom studied in college with her, and she's known for making large closed forms. So my mom had made all of these pots that were very unpot-like to me. I guess they were more like objects. They were very round with tiny openings in the top. Later, she made these more sculptural pieces that were constructed of torn slabs, and they were covered with scratchy marks. This piece on the left is made by my mom, and the piece on the right is by Peter Volkes, a very well-known ceramic artist. This was something I looked at my whole life. It was on the middle of the coffee table in the house I grew up in. It always seemed somewhat illegible to me and uncomfortable. In retrospect, being around my mother's work and growing up in that kind of environment really affected how I see and make things, probably more than most of my professors that I studied with or programs that I went to. Her work contributed to my sensibility, not necessarily to what my work looks like, but more to how it is. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Otherwise, I had a very traditional academic education with an emphasis on drawing and painting from life. You know, figures, landscapes. There was also an understanding that you had to become proficient in representational work before you could experiment with abstraction. To some extent, I agree with that. When I graduated, though, I realized that my work was a reflection of my teachers' styles and interests, and I had some basic skills, which I think is fairly common. So then I began to try to figure out where my own interests fit in. This is a pretty famous painting by Hans Hofmann. He was a strong influence on most of my professors. He's known for combining Matisse's color and Cubism's juggling of form. So his paintings have an action called push and pull, referring to the relationships between color and space and how shapes come forward and recede. This is an Indian miniature. I spent a lot of time looking at Indian miniatures, manuscript illumination, and Japanese screen painting. Those influences provided a window for me into how to become more engaged and develop detail. In this work, the decorative excess is so engaging to me, and especially in Indian miniatures, the beauty really throws you off the trail of how truly weird the image is. This is my painting. It's kind of awesome like this because it's only 5 by 6 inches. Over the past 19 years or so, I've been investigating detail and focus. My reflex after my official education was to make something very embellished and involved. So in school, I always felt like I didn't have enough time to do like what I wanted to do because I had assignments and we had to be very prolific and make a lot of work. So once I had my own studio and I was out of school, I started to figure out what I'm interested in creating. This is a Japanese screen painting. So each of these sort of divisions here, the panels are about the size of a door. So it's like a room divider. And this is the sensibility that I'm drawn to. The layering of atmosphere, shape, and image seems to have gelled in my mind and become part of the way I intuitively create space and form. This is a painting by Philip Guston, and I love it. I don't really want a viewer to see a redo of Philip Guston painting in my work, but I'd like to capture the urgency and direct connection that his work holds for me. So I love this clumpy bunch of Mickey Mouse shoes. This is mine, another miniature, 5 by 6 inches, and these paintings are made by layering transparent paint and then masses of tiny mark making. Because they are so built up, they have a distinct texture, and often the wood grain plays an important role. Actually, the wood grain gave me the direction for how I began a painting. So I don't know if you can see sort of like the vertical wood grain is coming through the surface of the paint. So these boards are unprimed, which means they have no gesso, no white paint going down first, they're just wood grain. And my first impulse is to look at that as if it were a drawing. Oh, this is an artist that I frantically admire, Kathy Butterly. She makes these amazing pots. They're about that big, under 12 inches, and they are covered in tiny details and sometimes fired up to 30 times. And she considers herself a painter, which I think is cool. So just as my work doesn't resemble my mother's work, it generally does not resemble the work I admire, but I'm sure there are connections. I focus on process and materials, the combination of the mechanical, the body, and personal history. I'm trying to make paintings that are satisfying but also uncomfortable, and curiosity plays a big role. Like I want to see what it will look like if I do this entire area full of tiny dots, or if I cover everything in a white glaze, or whatever other kinds of ideas I come up with. This is another Japanese screen painting. This calligraphic, sparse image of grasses is an image I've gone back to over and over. So at this time, I had a gallery in Brooklyn who took all of my completed work. And since my work was so small, I could fit 20 paintings into Trader Joe's bags, and my studio was completely empty. So I was happy about the gallery, but it was sort of difficult for me to hand over my entire studio of completed work. And so I impulsively made a rubbing directly from one of the paintings. So this is a rubbing on Yupo, which is a white Japanese synthetic paper, and it's very plasticky, but for some reason, if you put it down on top of something and you rub, like, you know, sort of like when you're in elementary school and you do leaf rubbings with a crayon, the image comes through. So this is a rubbing of what the painting actually feels like versus what it looks like, which was an interesting sort of thing that happened. And I painted back into the rubbings ultimately from memory, even though I could barely remember what they looked like, and as sort of a way of letting go of them. So I finally got a larger studio, and as my space and my life was changing, I was ready for my work to change. So I tried to figure out what the next scale would be and what the next surface would be. So I considered large slabs of wood, veneer. Really nothing was clicking. So I realized that I had this amazing wood grain right outside my window and started taking rubbings from my deck on Yupo. Again, that's a Japanese synthetic paper made of polypropylene. It's super bright white. This is actually not Yupo, but it was the only image I had of the deck for you. So the deck also is pressure treated. So even though the wood comes from nature, it's actually chemically infused wood, and the paper, which is synthetic, is actually a green material. So here's one of the first pieces combining graphite rubbings, painting, ink, and drawing on Yupo, and it's 22 by 20. And this is the kind of drawing that I started doing inside all of those painted lines. So you can, no, this way. So inside all of those lines, it's like that, and I was working with a mechanical pen to do that. So, the line drawing has a mechanical quality, but it's done freehand. There's no straight edge, I don't use a ruler. And it has a timekeeping meditative quality. I also think a bit about medical monitoring, so there's a reference to life and death, or rather sort of keeping track of life. Back to timekeeping. Also thinking of all the various times you're monitored throughout your life, or that you see others on monitors. And at that time, my dad had a heart attack, so that was on my mind. This is an installation of those early pieces at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum in 2009. And I worked this way for a couple years. And then I started to scale up. So this is a 55 by 60 inch drawing on Yupo, and it's stapled up to the side of my garage so you can get a sense of the scale. And this is a painting by Chuck Close. You might recognize this. I saw his retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art several years ago, and I expected it to be very predictable. I thought it would be obvious. Grid, circle inside of circles, a system of color to make it real, but it's not. I was amazed by these paintings. It's truly his own process, and I have no idea how he makes it work, but I was pretty blown away by that. So in terms of process, a lot of the things about my work seem very obvious to me, but people have told me that it's less obvious to them. So I thought I would walk you through a painting. At each point here, I sort of thought, oh, I'm going to be done, and I was kind of racing to the finish, and each time it wasn't finished. And so that's how it ended up. And here it is at Three Rivers Community College in an exhibition in 2011. So this is work by Mark Bradford, one of my most favorite painters and artists. He makes enormous work out of layered paper that is glued on, embedded with twine, sanded, and then torn off and shredded. And this happens to be a temporary site-specific installation at the Hirshhorn at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and it's called Pickett's Charge. And there you can see the detail, like the hanging shreds of paper. It's really aggressively worked, and it's pretty amazing. So this is my studio, and this is where the work was heading at that time. The Mark Bradford work is current. This work is from like 2013-ish. I feel like this work seems related to Mark Bradford, though it's scaled down from what he does. He's making these rough constructions that are very aggressively handled, and I'm creating lines and sensation using paint. This view is of that body of work in the show in New Haven, which I was so excited to get the work out of the studio and see it with lights and space. So I'm varying my language as much as I can, trying to like maybe play with the wood grain going from the background to inside the forms. And this is a piece by Eva Hess, who's another favorite, and I feel like it's very related to the way that the line work is starting to happen. And that's a close-up, so you can see how things are starting to change. Okay, so this is a painting by Barnaby Furness that was shown at Marianne Boesky, which is a gallery in New York City, called If Wishes Were Fishes. And it's you can see from the guy standing there, it's 12 by 16 feet. So I saw it with a friend and I was completely blown away. And what's strange is it does look rather violent. When sitting in front of it, it didn't feel that way, and I think it's because you can't take in the entire 16 feet of this painting in one look the way you can when it's brought down to size like this. But I was so struck by how it's made. It's painted very thinly, as if it were done in one sitting, and there's faint pencil lines around the birds and the figures. The blue background is very washy and transparent, and the triangles at the bottom are painted like forms in paintings by the artist Leger. He's a French artist. You might know of him. Let's see. So on the bottom here is a detail of that painting and those triangles that I was talking about, and above is a painting by Leger from 2019. And this is a work that I created coming out of seeing that painting and thinking about that kind of transparency and gradient, and it's actually going back to that and then seeing this, it's more connected than I realized. but I feel like it's individual enough that if I didn't tell you, you might not know, hopefully. So I was working with wash and letting the paint drip and puddle and seeing how those transparencies on Yupo, which, because it's plastic, or it's polypropylene, it's not absorbent. Everything sits on top. So the paint, it's like layers of dry paint on top of dry paint. Nothing mixes, they don't blend. And that was an interesting sort of reality of the way the paint was going on. So that's an installation of that work in 2013 at Rick Wester Fine Art, my first solo show in New York City. Whoops, we missed one there. Okay, so moving on, I used leaves also because I started sort of thinking like, okay, people do leaf rubbings, I'm just going to do it, get it out of the way. And it sort of became a part of my work. I have these enormous leaves in my front yard. Strangely enough, I didn't realize that until I started doing this. They're from a sycamore tree and they're giant. They are sometimes up to 20 inches, and so this is a rubbing of just the leaves so you can get a sense of how obsessed I am with them. And this piece is 60 by 48, and it was inspired by a shrub called burning bush, which is native to Connecticut, and it's growing in my backyard and all over the town where I live in Westport. So I don't usually do this, but in this case I'll show you that's the shrub. So it's pretty amazing, and I didn't quite capture it, but that was the inspiration. And this is that work at Pulse, New York City in 2015, which is an art fair that I did with Rick Wester Fine Art. This work is all 5 by 4 feet. So I was ready to work larger, but the largest roll of Yupo is 60 inches. So I moved on to canvas. So this is my studio. Not that glamorous, but it works. And so canvas comes in bigger rolls, so I can make much larger work. And this scale, which is the same as the work in the gallery here, is floor to ceiling in my studio. I start with a rubbing and a wash of color, which is watered down acrylic paint. And this was the first big painting I did on canvas in 2015, and it's about 6 by 8 feet. So the thing that I said about Yupo being not permeable, so all the paint sits up on top, working on raw canvas, it's the total opposite. It's super, super absorbent, and everything mixes. So this is, sometimes I hang them outside on my deck so I can see them, because you could see my studio is rather compact. It's my dog. And this is my house. The studio door is there under the deck. The tree above is where I have those giant leaves. And the stump in the backyard is my third source for rubbing. So you can see one of the canvases there on the snow in the very foreground. And this is my view out the studio door. So I have a robin's nest under my deck most years, and I kind of obsess over them. If I put my phone down on the deck with the camera lens right in the crack, I can see directly into the nest. Whoops, oh boy. Yeah, like that. So I'm showing you these images because I want you to see what I do when I'm in and out of my studio, around my home, and sort of what's filtering into my process. Here are a few more influences also. I saw this painting in 1995 in Siena, Italy, and I've never forgotten it. The image on the right is a close-up of this primary image here, and I just think it's unexpected. It's like a weather painting from the 1500s. I just think it's cool. So this is Botticelli's La Primavera, and the figure in the very upper right is Zephyr, the west wind, which for some reason that sticks in my head. I think a lot of my work feels windy. This is another piece on Yupo that was ongoing while I was also working on canvas. So it's 3 panels next to each other, so it's 5 feet tall by 12 feet wide. And this was just a funny thing. I submitted to Save Art Space, which is an organization that puts artwork on public ad space. So one day I woke up and looked at Instagram, and they had posted this without telling me. And a few hours later, I got an email about the post saying they'd let me know in a few weeks in advance if a piece is selected for a real billboard, but this one was just Photoshop. But it was kind of crazy because I woke up and I was like, did they do this without telling me? it was cool. Would have been cooler if it was real, but. Okay, so one way I try out ideas is on my phone. I have a super basic drawing app. In this case, I took a photo of the painting and drew on top of it until I came up with the black grid. So these are examples of digital sketches that I did on my phone. And the one on the bottom is what ended up happening, and that became the painting. This piece is here in the gallery. So I tried a few different ideas before I came up with this green form on the bottom. So here's a few thoughts I had before it all came together. So back outside with the paintings. This was the announcement I had for a show last year in New York. So in this show, I began consciously to think about time as a concept, the idea of collapsing past, present, and future tenses. So to me, that has to do with the many, many layers of lines meshing and the foreground and background flickering back and forth. And I started thinking about the rubbings, and similar to the way fossils freeze a living thing at a single moment, it doesn't actually deteriorate. It's just, this is that moment. So I'm using organic material in different states of living or decomposition and embedding the impression of that thing, leaf, wood, or tree stump. And layering the rubbings with dense line work that ends up looking like textiles or topographic maps or diagrams. So this painting is also here, and so are some of these. As I said, some aspects of these paintings are generated on an iPhone app, and others are materials driven, meaning it results from how paint comes off a brush or tool onto the canvas, how colors blend, how wet and dry combine, just basic things that can be surprising. So these are leaves from a plant, or I'm not sure if it's a plant or a tree, called Paulownia. And I saw them, this is the only leaf or object that I use for rubbings that's not from my home. But they were so big, and I was driving, and my son was with me, and I was like, oh my God, look at those leaves. And we were in this sort of like no man's land in like Mount Kisco. And there was like no houses, so it was like sort of safe to say no one really owned it. And he's like, fine, pull over. And he got out and like grabbed them. So those are the rubbings from that tree. And they're most prominent in this pink painting, and this is the very beginning of it. So you can see the leaf rubbings up on the right. Oops. And here it is in the completed form in the gallery. Here, actually, I took that picture. So here's an example of how the drawing app functions for me. And you guys, this is probably going to seem super primitive to you because I'm sure you're way more advanced with stuff like this than I am, but this is the best I can do. So that's the iPhone drawing, and that's how the painting looked at the time. And that's how the painted lines look. So it might seem easy, like they're drawn on the phone and then just painted on, but actually I print out the image and then I figure out where all the marks are going to go in this very analog way. So it's kind of painstaking and very primitive, and things change in the process. So it's just like another source. These kinds of drawings are another source for me. It doesn't necessarily come out that way, but it was an interesting process, and kinds of marks that I would have never made had I not been working like that. So last March I started new rubbings, and these paintings, what ended up as these paintings, are here in the show. So this is how one of them began. I started the rubbings before snowfall was expected. It was supposed to be really bad. And then I left the canvas outside. This was the first time I've ever done this, and I was curious to see what would happen. So that line right there is snow, which I thought was also kind of cool. I waited all week for the snow to melt and left it there. You can see the rubbing from the tree stump that's underneath. And here's how it ended up. It had a little mud and grass stain, and it was much more muted than the other rubbings. Sorry. Then I started with tons of water and dripping paint, and my studio is a walkout basement, so it's concrete floor, and I get to do that, and I don't care. And it's kind of awesome that way. Even though it's not that glamorous, it's fun to be able to let puddles form, and then when I come back down later, it's just gone. And it turned into this. This show is called Time Release in the gallery here. So if you have the opportunity to go into the gallery and look at these paintings in person, you might notice that if you sit in front of one of them for a little while, maybe 10 minutes, you'll notice more and more as time passes. They unfold or release. And for me, the color equates to a feeling, a memory or sensation, or emotion, like a state of being. And the imagery emerges, the formal actions within the work evoke a sensory experience like seeing, thinking, feeling, or remembering. So at the same time as that green one was going on, this was happening, and it kind of went in a very different direction, and that's a close-up of the center. So the background treatment for the purple one and this one are related, but this one was sitting for so long, and I knew it wasn't finished, but I couldn't decide what to do. So I did these two sketches, and then I combined them. And that's the painting that's here. Thank you.